A man named David Ben-Gurion steps forward and declares the birth of a new nation, Israel. For the Jewish people, it was a moment of triumph, a long-awaited homeland finally realized after centuries of exile, persecution, and genocide. But for the Arab world, it was a catastrophe in the making. Within 24 hours, the armies of 5 Arab nations launched an invasion. Cities burned, borders vanished, and more than 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes. This wasn't just a war between neighbors. It was the beginning of a conflict that would redraw the Middle East and echo through generations. This is the story of how one war created 2 futures. Welcome to Erahive, where history speaks, and today, we dive into the first Arab-Israeli War of 1948. To understand the War of 1948, we have to go back decades. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Palestine fell into the hands of the British under the League of Nations mandate. But the land wasn't empty. It was home to 2 peoples, Arabs, who had lived there for generations, and Jews, many of whom were returning from exile, persecution, or seeking refuge from rising anti-Semitism in Europe. The British promised both sides something they couldn't deliver: an Arab homeland and a Jewish one. These contradictions would ignite deep resentment, fear, and violence. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, tensions boiled over: riots, revolts, retaliations. Britain tried to control the chaos with restrictive laws, like the 1939 White Paper, which limited Jewish immigration just as the Holocaust was beginning. After World War II, the situation exploded. The world witnessed the horrors of Nazi genocide, and support for a Jewish homeland surged. Meanwhile, the Arab majority in Palestine feared they were losing their land, their future, their identity. And as both sides armed themselves for what was coming, one thing became clear: Palestine was a land teetering on the edge of war. And in 1947, the world would make a decision that changed everything. November 29, 1947, a date that would etch itself into the fate of the Middle East. The United Nations had a plan, a bold one. They proposed to divide the land of Palestine into 2 independent states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international control. For many Jews, it was a moment of triumph. After centuries of persecution, exile, and the trauma of the Holocaust, the world had finally offered them a homeland. But for the Arab Palestinians, it was a betrayal. The plan gave 55% of the land to the Jewish state, even though Jews made up only about 1/3 of the population and owned less than 10% of the land. To them, this wasn't a solution, it was a robbery. In the UN General Assembly, 33 countries voted in favor of the partition. 13 voted against, 10 abstained. The Arab states walked out in protest. They didn't just reject the plan, they warned the world. If a Jewish state were declared, war would follow. The lines were drawn. The countdown to conflict had begun. As the ink dried on the UN's partition vote, the streets of Palestine erupted. Violence broke out between the Arab and Jewish communities almost immediately. It wasn't just protests, it was ambushes, bombings, and bloodshed. This wasn't yet a war between states, it was a civil war between neighbors. In towns, on farms, even inside cities like Jerusalem and Jaffa, Jewish militias like the Haganah, Irgun, and the Stern Gang began organizing for war. Palestinian fighters, along with volunteer Arab groups like the Arab Liberation Army, launched attacks of their own. Then came Deir Yassin, April 1948, a massacre of over 100 Arab villagers by Irgun and Stern fighters. The news of the killings spread like wildfire, sparking fear across Palestinian communities. Tens of thousands fled their homes, not knowing they would never return. At the same time, Zionist immigration surged, with more fighters, more weapons, and more determination. The land was fragmenting, the people dividing, and the British, they were packing up, preparing to leave. The mandate was collapsing, and into the vacuum, a new state and a regional war was about to be born. May 14, 1948, the world held its breath. On Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, under a portrait of Theodore Herzl, David Ben-Gurion stood before a small gathering and made history. The State of Israel is established. With those words, after nearly 2,000 years of diaspora, the Jewish people had a state. Crowds danced in the streets. The Israeli flag flew proudly, but behind the celebration there was urgency, fear, and the smell of war. Ben-Gurion's declaration spoke of freedom, equality, and peace. It promised rights for all citizens, Jews and Arabs alike, without discrimination of race, religion, or gender. But for Palestinians, this moment marked not freedom, but displacement. Hundreds of thousands had already fled. For them, the creation of Israel wasn't liberation, it was a catastrophe, al-Nakba. Meanwhile, just hours after Ben-Gurion's speech, British rule officially ended, and the armies of 5 Arab nations were already preparing to strike. The dream of one people would become the nightmare of another. And by morning, a new war, the First Arab-Israeli War, had begun, May 15, 1948, just hours after the Israeli Declaration of Independence. 5 Arab nations launched a full-scale invasion: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Their mission? To destroy the newborn state of Israel and reclaim the land for the Arabs of Palestine. From the south, Egyptian tanks thundered in from the Sinai, crossing into the Negev desert. To the east, Jordan's Arab Legion, one of the best-trained armies in the region, swept through the West Bank. Iraqi forces moved in from the northeast, while Syrian and Lebanese troops attacked from the north. On paper, the Arab coalition looked overwhelming, 5 nations versus 1, and most of them backed by British weapons and training. But the truth was more complicated. The Arab armies didn't trust each other. Each had its own goal, not to save Palestine, but to carve up its remains for their own strategic gain. And as historian Avishai Margalit would later note, the Arab war effort was united in rhetoric, but divided in reality. Israel, outgunned and surrounded, stood at the edge of annihilation, but the chaos among its enemies would prove to be its greatest advantage. Jerusalem, sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, now became the center of a brutal battle. After the British withdrew, the city was plunged into darkness, its roads cut, and its people isolated. The Arab Legion of Transjordan, commanded by British-trained officers, advanced quickly. On May 18th, they seized Latrun, a strategic fortress west of Jerusalem, severing Israel's only supply route into the besieged city. Inside Jewish Jerusalem, food and ammunition were running dangerously low. Desperation set in. Water was rationed. Bread lines stretched for hours. Children slept in basements as mortars rained down from the surrounding hills. Ben-Gurion ordered a breakthrough. 3 failed assaults on Latrun followed. Hundreds of young, poorly trained Israeli fighters were killed in the effort. But then came a turning point. In secret, the Israelis built a new road through the rocky hills, a rough, steep bypass. They called it the Burma Road. By June 10th, convoys of trucks were crawling through the makeshift path, bringing life back into the starving city. Jerusalem held out, not because it was well defended, but because it refused to fall. By June 1948, the war had reached a stalemate. The Arab armies had advanced, but Israel had not collapsed. Then, the United Nations brokered a 4-week ceasefire, beginning June 11th. What happened next would change the course of the war. Israel used the truce not to rest, but to rebuild. While the Arab states struggled with logistics and disunity, Israel transformed. Thousands of fresh recruits were trained. Weapons, many smuggled in from Czechoslovakia, began arriving by ship and air. Tanks, rifles, and ammunition flooded into Israeli stockpiles, defying the arms embargo. The ragtag militia became the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, a structured, centralized army. By the end of the ceasefire, Israel had more than 65,000 troops, double its original number. Meanwhile, Arab coordination remained remained weak. Mistrust between Arab leaders, especially between Egypt and Jordan, paralyzed strategic unity. When the ceasefire ended, it wasn't the same war anymore. Israel now had the upper hand, militarily organized, politically unified, and strategically prepared. The tide of war was about to turn. When the truce ended on July 8, 1948, Israeli forces wasted no time. In the south, Egyptian troops had dug in, trying to hold the Negev and keep the road to Tel Aviv under threat. But the IDF launched a powerful counteroffensive, Operation Anfar, striking at key Egyptian positions. Fighting was brutal and costly, but Israel began regaining ground. In the north, a bold Israeli offensive, Operation Dekel, swept across Lower Galilee, pushing back Arab Liberation Army units and capturing the strategic town of Nazareth. This gave Israel control of crucial terrain from Haifa Bay to the Sea of Galilee. But the most decisive campaign came in the center. Israeli forces, under the command of Yigal Allon, launched Operation Dani, a massive push toward Lydda and Ramel, two major Arab towns that controlled the road to Jerusalem. After fierce urban combat, both cities fell. More than 50,000 Arab residents were displaced, triggering one of the most controversial episodes of the war, an exodus that still echoes in Palestinian memory. By the time the second UN truce took effect on July 18th, Israel had seized over 1,000 square kilometers of new territory, and Jerusalem, though still under siege, was no longer choking. The momentum had shifted. The war wasn't over, not yet. Israel's leaders knew that as long as the Egyptians held the southern front, especially the Negev desert, the state would remain exposed and divided. That's when they launched one of the most ambitious operations of the war, Operation Yoav. On October 15, 1948, the Israeli Air Force struck first. Czech-made Avia fighters and American B-17 bombers targeted Egyptian strongholds from Majdal to Gaza. The goal? Shatter Egyptian morale and blind their defenses. Next came the ground assault. Led by Yigal Allon, 3 Israeli brigades stormed into the Negev. Their mission? Break the siege, open the road to Beersheba, and crush the Egyptian presence in the region. And it worked. By October 22nd, Beersheba had fallen. The Egyptians were in full retreat. One of their brigades, over 4,000 soldiers, became completely encircled in the now famous Fallujah pocket. The Negev was now firmly in Israeli hands. But the price? Thousands displaced. Entire Palestinian villages were empty. The landscape of southern Palestine changed forever. Operation Yoav had turned the tide, but also deepened the roots of a conflict that was far from over. While the south burned, Israel turned its eyes north. Galilee, a region still contested, was home to scattered Arab Liberation Army units and a Syrian battalion. The Israeli command saw an opportunity: strike fast, strike hard. On October 29, 1948, just days after the success of Operation Yoav, Operation Hiram was unleashed. 4 Israeli brigades, led by General Moshe Carmel, surged forward with a clear objective to clear the Upper Galilee and secure Israel's northern frontier. In just 60 hours, the operation crushed Arab resistance. Over 800 Arab fighters were killed or captured, and the Israeli army not only took Upper Galilee, but pushed several kilometers into southern Lebanon, capturing border villages and reaching as far as the Litani River. But victory came at a cost. Entire Arab villages were depopulated. Thousands more Palestinians were forced to flee yet another wave in the growing refugee crisis. For the Zionist state, this was strategic consolidation. For the Palestinian people, it marked the vanishing of yet another homeland. Operation Hiram completed the military map but left the region more fractured than ever. To Israel, this was an unacceptable threat, and so the final and most ambitious Israeli offensive began, Operation Horef. On December 22nd, the Israeli Air Force struck Egyptian positions in Gaza and along the Mediterranean coast. It was a diversion, a trap. The real attack came further east. The Negev and 8th Brigades pierced the Egyptian lines at Bir Tamela and Oja al-Hafir, pushing deep into the Sinai Peninsula. For a moment, it seemed like Israel would march all the way to the Suez Canal. But then, pressure. Britain threatened military intervention if Israel didn't withdraw. Ben-Gurion hesitated, then pulled back. Capturing Rafah and taking the high ground, the war was drawing to a close. Egypt had been humiliated, its army shattered, and its dreams of Palestinian defense crushed. By December 1948, the war had reached a turning point. Israel had taken control of vast territories, but the south remained a major concern. Egyptian forces were still entrenched in Gaza and around the Fallujah pocket, threatening the fragile gains of the new Israeli state. To secure the Negev once and for all, Israel launched Operation Horeb. It began on December 22nd with a combination of artillery barrages, aerial strikes, and deceptive attacks. While the Egyptians were focused on defending the northern front, Israel executed its real plan, a deep encirclement maneuver against weakly defended southern positions near Bir Tamila. Israeli brigades, especially the 8th and Negev brigades, pierced through Egyptian lines and in a bold move, even entered the Sinai Peninsula, pushing Egyptian troops back toward El Arish. Cairo was stunned. As Egypt teetered on the edge of total collapse, Britain threatened to intervene, and Israel was forced to pull back, but not before bottling up Egyptian forces in Gaza and capturing strategic high ground. By January 7, 1949, the guns finally fell silent on the southern front. Israel had secured the Negev, and Egypt, realizing its position was untenable, became the first Arab state to negotiate an armistice. But peace would be fragile, and the seeds of future wars had already been sown. The guns fell silent, but the war was far from over. By early 1949, separate armistice agreements were signed between Israel and Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. These were not peace treaties. There were pauses in the fighting, pauses filled with uncertainty, betrayal, and the deep scars of war. Israel had emerged victorious, not just surviving the coordinated assault by 5 Arab armies, but expanding its territory far beyond the UN's original partition plan. From the 55% originally allotted to the Jewish state, Israel now controlled 78% of historic Palestine. But the human cost was staggering. Around 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, becoming refugees in neighboring Arab countries, in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Gaza Strip. Their homes were lost. Their villages, many of them, were destroyed. Their return, once a hope, would become one of the most contested issues in modern history. The promised Arab state of Palestine, it never materialized. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan. The Gaza Strip fell under Egyptian administration. Neither allowed the establishment of a truly independent Palestinian government. And so, the Palestinians found themselves stateless, scattered, and silenced, caught in a limbo between the dreams of independence and the realities of geopolitics. The war had also deeply reshaped the Middle East. Israel became a fact on the ground, recognized by the United States and the Soviet Union, and protected by its early victories. Meanwhile, the Arab world fractured, each regime blaming the other for the failure to save Palestine. Trust between the Arab states evaporated just as quickly as their unity had formed. And so began the Arab-Israeli conflict, a long, bloody struggle that would see multiple wars. The first Arab-Israeli war was over, but the consequences? They're still unfolding.